Welcome to the 12th session of Within the Shadow of the Galilean. Where are all the palm branches? We will look at Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, which is the beginning in the Christian tradition of what we call Holy Week. We will look at the difference between Western culture and Mediterranean culture, the power dynamics in the Roman Empire. We will look at the sources within the sources as we quest for what happens with Jesus as he enters Jerusalem. And then we will look at the passages from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to explore what they tell us about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. So let's get going. Most of us in the United States are familiar with this game. We can just see the short video and we know it's baseball. And we have an idea of its rules, and we have an idea of how it's played. However, few of us are familiar with this game, and few of us know the rules of this game and how to play this game. All of us, to some point, know the rules of the Western culture that we live in the United States today. And to some extent, we know the rules well enough to play that game. But few of us are familiar with how the world around the Mediterranean worked during the time of Jesus. Literally, it was all in the family.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
Guys like us, we had it made.
Those were the days.
So let's look at the power system of Imperial Rome during the time of Jesus and how privilege and wealth were distributed. The Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' life was Tiberius Caesar Augustus. He was the adopted son of Caesar Augustus. He is only the second emperor in the Roman Empire, so there's still conflict and tension around transitioning from a republic to an empire. But at this time, he, as an individual, had 40% of imperial resources, plus had just gained control of all the land of the empire as an emperor. And all those in the military pledged loyalty to him, not to the Roman Empire. The emperor's family had 30 to 40% of imperial resources. So they're just in one family, there's 70 to 80% of all the resources within the Roman Empire. But they had retainers too. In Israel, the significant retainer was someone we know of named Pontius Pilate, who was a governor and had direct rule of Judah and Galilee. But there was also the Jewish high priestly families. And it's really interesting. There are four families that are all interrelated that controlled the high priestly office for 80 to 90 years during the lifetime of Jesus and afterwards. And then there were significant retainers in Jerusalem, primarily the Sadducees and some of the Pharisees. And altogether, these groups retained about 80% of the resources of Judah and Samaria during the lifetime of Jesus. There were also other local retainers. One of them may have been Levi, who was a tax collector if he was a member of Jesus, but the vast majority of those who were Jesus's disciples, members of discipleship communities or kingdom communities, made up about 80 to 90% of the population and lived at a subsistence level. To live at a subsistence level in Jesus' time meant you would be lucky to live out a year. It's important to remember this imperial power structure because Pontius Pilate held the power of the Roman Empire in his hands, and those who were part of the Jerusalem governing retainers were there because they collaborated with Pilate and held their positions on behalf of the emperor, the Roman emperor. This is important because Jesus is coming to Jerusalem during Passover time, which is like our 4th of July celebration. It is a time when we celebrate our independence with fireworks and with parties, with gathering together with families, a festive time. It was also that for the Jews during the time of Jesus. Passover was a time when they celebrated their freedom from captivity in Egypt and being brought to the promised land. It was a time they remembered when God set them free. But it is a time of occupation when Jesus comes to Jerusalem and then goes into Jerusalem. It is within this setting of confrontation and conflict that we need to see Jesus of history coming into Jerusalem, and more specifically, how Jesus is remembered coming into Jerusalem. All 4 Gospels remember Jesus entering Jerusalem. And if you're looking at a Bible and there's a subheading, they often subtitle that Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Mark writes, and it's the first write, about Jesus' entry in Jerusalem. And Matthew and Luke follow the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew adds a little bit of his own. John, who I believe is an independent source, doesn't follow or draw upon the Gospel of Mark, has his own unique story of Jesus entering Jerusalem. And it is to those stories that we will turn to now. The way most of us know the story of Palm Sunday is by putting the 4 gospel stories together. But if we set them side by side, what we discover, each of the stories have 3 things in common. They have Jerusalem in common, they have a colt in common, and they have a blessing in common. With that in mind, we are going to look at the stories side by side. In the email you received for our session on Tuesday night, I attached a document. If you don't have that with you now, it may be a good time to pause the video and go find it. If you don't have it, you can easily just follow along because it's the next thing in the video. As the scene opens in Mark and Matthew and Luke, you'll notice that Jesus and the disciples are outside of Jerusalem. But in the Gospel of the Gospel of John, the scenes open in Jerusalem with a great crowd that has heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. The scene continues in Mark and Matthew and Luke with Jesus, one way or another, giving instructions to disciples to go find a colt. Or in the case of Matthew, they're to go find a donkey and a colt. And then in Mark and Luke, it is a colt that has never been ridden. And they untie it and they bring it to Jesus. And if anyone says or asks anything, just let them know that the Lord needs it, or needs them in the case of Matthew. We're going to let a few fireworks go off here because the next portion of Matthew is unique to the Gospel of Matthew and is one of the keys for understanding Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. So before we get to the second page, just let the fireworks happen. So here we are at the top of the second page of the document I sent out to you. And this is what Matthew added that neither Mark nor Luke have. John kind of quotes it later on, but this is what Matthew says. Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So Matthew does all this strange gymnastic stuff to get Jesus on both a colt and a donkey, because somehow this comes from the Jewish tradition that we find in the book of the prophet Zechariah. And we'll come back to that later. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples go get a colt. Jesus sits on the colt, or they put Jesus on the colt, and there's crowds surrounding Jesus as he's heading toward Jerusalem. It is at this point in the Gospel of John that the folks in Jerusalem get palm branches and then go out to meet Jesus. This brings us to the end of our second page of the document I sent out about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Then at the beginning of the third page, there's another time for fireworks. So let's take a pause and let the fireworks happen. Now that all the folks have gathered around Jesus, they're just going nuts. They've laid down cloaks on the road and branches. In the Gospel of John, palm branches. And in Mark and Matthew and John, they're shouting, Hosanna, which means save. And then the blessing. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Or blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. That's in Luke. Or blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. That's how they parade Jesus into Jerusalem. But that's probably not how Jesus got into Jerusalem. He probably came with some members of his communities of faith from Galilee, those who came before and after him, the group that came with him, that surrounded him, and maybe some few folks from Jerusalem who were members of a discipleship community of his came out to greet him. But they reflected and thought and pondered and they organized the way Jesus came into Jerusalem through two crucial reflections from their sacred story, from the Hebrew Bible, one found in Zechariah chapter 9 and the other Psalm 180. Those are crucial for understanding early reflections on Jesus's Passion Week, Holy Week. Now you know why Jesus came riding into Jerusalem on a colt, and Matthew, who wanted to remain as faithful as possible to the passage from Zechariah, has Jesus riding both a colt and a donkey. And we know one of the things that those around Jesus were hoping for has deep roots in the Hebrew tradition of one who is blessed that is coming in the name of the Lord. So what is remembered is that Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and Jesus comes, and that coming has political consequences and political effects. It rouses up a sense of king and kingdom. Now, does some of that go back to the life of Jesus? Possibly. It is clearly picked up soon after his death as they proclaim resurrection. I would guess that Jesus did not think of himself as the king of Israel, but maybe some of those in his discipleship communities did. But we do know that by the end of this week, Jesus will be executed. And the reason he's executed is on charges of insurrection as King of the Jews. And it all begins the next day when Jesus visits the temple.